The recent phone call and the subsequent announcement of a high-level meeting were not acts of diplomacy. They were a direct, public political maneuver designed to corner Vladimir Putin. The entire setup, from the timing to the location, was an ego-driven ultimatum masked as a peace initiative. This is the moment a geopolitical rivalry was transformed into a personal reckoning, proving that Putin's arrogance has finally created the most formidable and unpredictable enemy possible. This is FPV Explainer, where we break down the most fascinating stories in drone warfare. If you're enjoying this deep dive, hit the like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us what topic you want to see next. Your feedback shapes our future videos and keeps us bringing you clear, detailed analysis from the front lines. The core of this strategic maneuver is the American president's desire for public vindication. The Kremlin's fatal miscalculation was to publicly humiliate the president after their previous meeting in Anchorage. By allowing media to portray the president as naive and by rejecting his initial peace proposals while offering nothing in return, the Russian leader committed the cardinal sin of politics. He made the American president look weak. The response we are now seeing is a direct, proportional effort to reclaim dominance. The decision to immediately call for a meeting, not on Putin's terms, but under the gaze of global media, is a display of dominance designed to force Putin to react. The announcement of a future meeting in Budapest, followed by a high-level pre-meeting led by the Secretary of State, is a deliberate exercise in political coercion. It forces Putin to remain engaged in a negotiation he demonstrably does not want, under terms dictated by his opponent. Putin's initial impulse in Anchorage was to dismiss diplomacy and launch into a long, irrelevant historical lecture about the origins of Russia, mentioning figures like Rurik and Yaroslav the Wise. This tactic, designed to bore and overwhelm, failed. It merely angered the American president, who was focused on the immediate and transactional. The result was the cancellation of a joint dinner and expanded talks, a clear signal that the meeting was a political disaster for the Kremlin. The current announcement is a tactical test. The American side is demanding a massive political shift from the Kremlin. They are requiring proof that Putin is willing to move beyond his maximalist demands, the complete capitulation of Ukraine and the handover of the entire Donbass. The key objective of the Secretary of State's preliminary meeting is to determine if Russia is willing to offer any real concession. If Russia repeats its past performance, offering nothing but historical lectures and intransigence, the anticipated meeting between the two leaders will be instantly canceled. This would be a second and far more devastating public humiliation for Putin, clearly signaling to the world that he is the obstacle to peace. This strategic exposure places Putin in an immediate and inescapable trap. He is forced to choose between two catastrophic options: either offer a significant concession, a ceasefire or troop withdrawal that compromises his military position, or reject the talks and be branded globally as the isolated aggressor who refuses peace, thereby justifying the immediate application of new crushing sanctions and arms transfers. The entire sequence is a masterful political trap, demonstrating that the American president's wounded ego has been transformed into a highly effective strategic weapon against the Kremlin. We have established the immediate political theater orchestrated by the American president. Now, we must analyze Vladimir Putin's critical blunder that set this entire confrontation in motion. His profound miscalculation of his rival's personality and his subsequent tactical arrogance during their previous meeting. The core of his strategic failure lies in the moment he chose history over diplomacy, guaranteeing the escalation he now desperately seeks to avoid. The entire premise of the meeting in Anchorage was built on an illusion: the American president's mistaken belief that a deal was possible. Putin entered the talks knowing the stakes, yet he chose to treat the highly anticipated diplomatic event not as a negotiation, but as a personal tutorial. Instead of offering the simple, face-saving concession of a ceasefire that the American side expected in return for sanctions relief, the Russian leader chose to lecture. He launched into a long, detailed, and utterly irrelevant historical lecture recounting the lineage of Russian and Ukrainian rulers, Rurik of Novgorod, Yaroslav the Wise, and Hetman Bogdan Khmelnytsky. This was a classic tactical error born of the dictator's information bubble. Putin, insulated by years of sycophantic reports, genuinely believes that his historical narrative, the lie that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, is a compelling, undeniable truth. He assumed that by overwhelming the American president with this historical evidence, he could simply convince him of the righteousness of the Russian cause. But he misjudged his audience completely. The American president is not a historian. He is a transactional dealmaker. He does not care about 10th century princes. He cares about an immediate political victory. The lecture was not persuasive. It was irritating. The consequence was immediate and catastrophic for Moscow. According to sources familiar with the talks, the American president's patience evaporated. He was not only bored, but angered by the time wasting, realizing that the deal in the pocket he had been promised by his own envoy was based on a flawed premise. The American president reportedly raised his voice multiple times and ultimately delivered the final decisive blow. He abruptly cut the meeting short and canceled the planned joint lunch and expanded economic talks. This public humiliation, the visible signs of the meeting's collapse, was instantly seized upon by global media, painting a clear picture of failure and disrespect. This failure of communication and judgment fundamentally altered the dynamic between the two leaders. Putin's historical arrogance was interpreted as strategic contempt. The American president, driven by the need to re-establish his political dominance and silence his domestic critics, had been personally provoked. This was the moment the American position pivoted from seeking compromise to seeking coercion. The diplomatic path was replaced by the path of retribution. The strategic damage was immediate. The failure of the Anchorage summit directly led to the U.S. giving Ukraine the green light to strike Russian energy infrastructure. This was a clear act of punishment, a proportional response to Putin's arrogance. The entire current economic pressure campaign, the threat of Tomahawks, and the massive arms deals are all direct consequences of the dictator's choice to prioritize an academic lecture over a strategic ceasefire. Putin was trapped by his own historical delusion, and the price of his arrogance is now the accelerating collapse of his war effort.
We have established the psychological blunder of the Russian leader and the collapse of the diplomatic track. Now we turn to the most direct and devastating consequence of the Anchorage failure, the strategic decision by the American administration to weaponize intelligence, effectively removing the red line that had previously protected Russian military and economic assets. This was a move of pure retribution, turning American reconnaissance capabilities into a direct engine of Ukrainian offensive power. The central failure of the Anchorage summit directly led to a profound policy pivot. The American president, angered by Putin's refusal to engage in good faith, immediately sanctioned a level of intelligence sharing that had previously been considered too escalatory. According to reports from the Financial Times and CNN, the U.S. began transferring highly detailed reconnaissance data to Kyiv. This was not the general high-level satellite imagery previously provided. This was actionable intelligence designed to facilitate strikes deep into Russian territory. To understand the weight of this decision, one must recognize the nature of the previous red line. The U.S. had long constrained Ukraine from striking Russian energy and infrastructure targets, fearing that such actions would lead to an uncontrolled escalation or disrupt global oil markets. This policy, though politically cautious, created a strategic sanctuary for Russia. The Russian military could safely position its air defense systems and logistical hubs far behind the front line, confident they were protected by American diplomatic restraint. The moment the Anchorage talks failed, that restraint was lifted, and the sanctuary was erased. The intelligence provided by the US is the key to unlocking Ukraine's long-range arsenal. Any static target, like an oil refinery or a power plant, can be located on a map. However, to strike it successfully, especially with high-cost, long-range drones and missiles, Ukraine needs to know the location of Russia's mobile, high-value air defense systems, the S-400s and the Buk units. American satellite and electronic surveillance capabilities provide this critical, real-time picture of the Russian air defense grid. This information allows Ukrainian military planners to optimize their drone and missile flight paths, guiding them around the strongest points of Russian radar coverage and ensuring a much higher rate of successful penetration. The practical consequences of this policy shift were immediate and devastating. The very infrastructure the US had previously requested Ukraine to spare, the oil refineries, became the primary targets. The subsequent wave of Ukrainian kinetic sanctions, the sustained, successful strikes on Russian refineries that caused massive domestic fuel shortages, is a direct, measurable result of the American intelligence sharing. The strikes were not a matter of luck. They were a matter of precise, US-enabled targeting. This is the ultimate tool of coercion. The threat of conventional escalation is now fully delivered by American intelligence. The Kremlin now knows that its failure to concede at the negotiating table has resulted in the US becoming an active, if indirect, participant in the deep strike campaign. This action forces Russia to make an impossible strategic choice: either drain its frontline resources to defend its cities hundreds of kilometers away, or leave its industrial and energy centers exposed to destruction. The removal of the red line is the strategic squeeze that has now put Vladimir Putin firmly in a trap.
We have analyzed the collapse of the diplomatic facade and the devastating precision provided by American intelligence. But the full leverage the US is now applying to Vladimir Putin is economic, utilizing a complex system of financial coercion and military threat that completely chokes the revenue streams funding the war. The goal is to make the war financially unviable, and the current administration is now using every available tool to ensure that outcome. The pressure is manifesting in three interlocking powerful fronts: oil market sanctions, the maritime blockade of the shadow fleet, and the strategic threat of advanced weaponry. First, the most crucial pressure is the financial isolation of Russian oil exports, targeting the largest buyers. The president's rhetoric on this matter, his public declaration regarding India, was a clear political hammer. While official Indian sources may be reserved, the military and diplomatic pressure is working. The US is leveraging its dominant position in global finance and trade, subtly forcing major purchasers like India to fundamentally reassess the risk of continuing to trade with Moscow. The financial cost of being cut off from US markets and banking systems is simply too high. India's gradual yet significant reduction in purchases of discounted Russian crude is a testament to this pressure. This forces Russia to find new buyers, increasing transportation costs and drastically cutting into the already diminished profit margin from its oil sales, thus starving the war budget. Second, the maritime blockade of the shadow fleet is turning the screws on Russian logistics. This is the fleet of aging, often uninsured tankers Russia uses to bypass Western sanctions and transport its oil globally. The recent highly public seizure of a Russian-linked tanker by French authorities is a powerful signal. It demonstrates that the diplomatic talk is now backed by naval enforcement. By disrupting the operations of this fleet, the international coalition is increasing the cost, risk, and time required for Russia to sell its crude. This creates a severe logistical chokehold that directly reduces the currency flowing into the Kremlin's coffers. The disruption is a deliberate, strategic countermeasure to Russia's initial hybrid moves. Third, the strategic threat of advanced weaponry is the final component of this financial chokehold. The political authorization to transfer weapons, like the Tomahawk cruise missile, is tied directly to the economic strategy. This isn't just about military capability, it's about raising the potential cost of the war to an existential level. The Tomahawk, with its long range, threatens every major industrial and energy hub across European Russia. The Kremlin must now divert massive, expensive resources, its S-400s and Buk air defense batteries, from the front lines to defend these non-military assets. This act of military dispersal is an economic drain, forcing the Russian military to spend billions on defense against targets that were previously protected by US political restraint. The combination of these actions, the reduction of oil revenue from the east, the physical blockade of the seas, and the massive financial drain of defending a sprawling, vulnerable homeland, creates a no-win scenario for the Kremlin. The diplomatic game is now backed by overwhelming force, and the simple truth is that Vladimir Putin cannot afford the price of this continued conflict. The economic noose is tightening, and the inevitable outcome is the complete financial and military collapse of the Russian war effort.
We have meticulously analyzed the political miscalculation, the collapse of diplomacy, and the formidable economic and military pressure now exerted by the United States and its allies. Now, we deliver the final, unavoidable conclusion. The war has entered an irreversible phase of Russian defeat, and the final peace will be dictated by Ukraine's terms. This outcome is assured because Vladimir Putin has exhausted his resources, his diplomatic leverage, and his strategic options. The core of this impending defeat is the structural shift in the balance of power, a change driven not by frontal assaults, but by strategic attrition and coercion. The entire campaign to isolate Russia has coalesced into a single, overwhelming force that the Kremlin cannot repel. The military noose. The political decision to lift the unrestricted zones and provide intelligence for deep strikes, combined with the looming threat of weapons like the Tomahawk missile, forces Russia to spend its remaining billions defending stationary industrial targets. This colossal defensive drain compromises the viability of the entire frontline effort. The financial chokehold. The coordinated pressure on major oil buyers like India, coupled with the active maritime blockade of the Shadow Fleet, directly starves the Russian war budget. Moscow cannot sustain its massive military expenditure when its chief revenue stream is being systematically severed. The crucial miscalculation by Vladimir Putin was his fundamental belief that the West would remain divided and that the war would be fought on his terms. The moment he publicly rejected the American president's offer of mediation, he guaranteed an escalation that would prove fatal. His arrogance created a powerful, unified strategic response that has now placed him in an unsolvable diplomatic trap. He must choose between offering unacceptable concessions, a political humiliation, or guaranteeing the complete economic and military collapse of his country, a historical ruin. The war is no longer a localized struggle for territory. It is a systemic confrontation between an authoritarian past and a democratic future, and the democratic system has finally rallied. The massive proposed $90 billion arms deal and the agreement to co-produce drones are long-term investments that guarantee Ukraine's future military self-sufficiency, ensuring that the Russian war of attrition has a definite financial expiration date. The final verdict is sealed. Russia's capacity to continue the war is finite, its financial arteries are being severed, and its military is cornered. The war will end not with a final battlefield conquest, but with the moment the Kremlin realizes it can no longer afford to pay its army, supply its troops, or maintain the fragile social contract with its population. The end is now a political and economic inevitability that will be dictated by Kyiv.